All right, I've got Dr. Steven Gundry on the show today. He's a four-time New York Times best-selling author. He's also the host of the Dr. Gundry podcast, and he's the founder of the telemedicine clinic gundryhealth.com. Dr. Gundry, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Great to be here.
Excited to dive into things with you today. I know you've got a new book out, The Gut-Brain Paradox, How to Improve Your Mood, Clear Brain Fog, Reverse Disease by Healing Your Microbiome. I just want to jump right into it, man. I've read all your books. You actually, I just want to say you do an amazing job of breaking down complex issues in an entertaining but flavorful way where it actually keeps everybody engaged. I want to just tell you up front, like your books are always turn pagers for me. But I know you don't do things for accident. Like you're not going to put a book out in the world unless you feel you're compelled to. When you just look at your other books, from Plant Paradox, The Keto Code, and now this one, what inspired you or motivated you? What was the big difference from all these other books that you've written that also unlocked a lot of, I think, what you were seeing in your clinic? That's why you wrote Plant Paradox. That's why you wrote The Keto Code. What's transpired that led to this?
Well, you're right. I don't write a book just to write a book. Almost all my books kind of follow on something that either I went down a rabbit hole on the previous book that went, oh my gosh, I didn't know that it was this complex. And in Gut Check, which in a lot of ways, with my current book, in a lot of ways is the Plant Paradox 2.0. One of the things that I was trying to convince people is that the microbiome, the bacteria in our gut, in our mouth, on every surface, has a whole lot more control over our brain and things we do than really most of us, number one, could imagine, and most of us kind of don't want to imagine that a single cell organism could actually have that much power over our behavior, our addictions, our dementia, you kind of name it. So I said, I haven't done enough of this. And speaking of patients, I still see patients 6 days a week in my two offices. And one of the things that's interesting that I should have noticed years ago, I've been doing this now for 25 years. And early on, a lot of my patients are female. And, they'd come to me for being overweight or an autoimmune disease, diabetes. And a lot of them, they'd put on their little form, depression, and they'd be on one or two antidepressants. And they almost would always say, oh, yeah, I've been on those for 20 years. And just as an aside. And as we went along, a lot of them would say, and I write about this in the book, oh, by the way, 6 months into this, I'm not taking my antidepressants anymore. Is that okay? I don't need them anymore. Is that okay? And so you go, well, yeah, that's okay. And so I said, let's go down. Why is it that you're on antidepressants, number one, and why is it that you now can get rid of it? And that's really because we've actually changed the bacteria in your gut, and we've changed the products that these bacteria make that either caused you to be depressed in the first place, or now you're getting the bacterial products that have cured your depression. And it's pretty cool to watch this. So I said, I need to, that's what I need to do next, is talk about the brain and the microbiome.
Yeah, but it's so much more than that because I got to tell you, I'm reading the book, and I mean, we're talking about people with lifelong illnesses. I think one woman was walking with a cane, and then like 6 months later is not. I mean, we're talking about, like you mentioned, Alzheimer's, dementia, neurodegenerative diseases, and then you put them on a specific protocol, and boom, within 6 months, they're giving you a hug, saying, "Oh my God, I can walk again," like pretty easily. I'm reading the book and I'm blown away because as a health guy myself and just kind of been in the holistic health coaching space for over 10 years, I'm always learning from people like yourself and others. And I always come back to this issue like thinking it's a toxicity issue. Well, there's toxins that are blocking this. But when I got done reading the book, I almost felt like it was so simple. Like, no, Joel, just like if we can just focus on the gut through nutrition and changing the microbiome in a positive way, everything else is going to get better. And that's just kind of what I saw. Is it that simple, or was it that simple? I mean, you made it seem that way in the book, but obviously patients are more complex than we can imagine.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dale Bredesen, who wrote The End of Alzheimer's, has become a good friend through the years. And Dale and I will agree that, yeah, in certain people, we've got to go look for heavy metals, we've got to go look for mycotoxins, and so on. One of the things that has impressed me is if you look at super old people who are thriving, and you look at their gut microbiome, and this has been done. And I wrote about this in Gut Check. One of the things that's fascinating is that these people have a collection of bacteria that are really good at breaking down what are called xenobiotics. And these are all these crazy endocrine disruptors. These are mycotoxins. And one of the arguments I make with my patients who do have mycotoxin sensitivity is you got to remember that bacteria and molds and funguses are actually competing for the same resources. They're looking for carbon atoms, and they hate each other. In fact, most antibiotics are derived from funguses. And so funguses and bacteria are really kind of always at war. And so bacteria have a defense mechanism against funguses. And the cool thing about bacteria is that bacteria can do gene transfer. You can actually get pieces of genes from one bacteria that it'll send to another bacteria and turn it into kind of a different bacteria. And we hear about, for instance, antibiotic resistance. And well, bacteria acquire antibiotic resistance because one bacteria isn't sensitive to that antibiotic, which is a fungal product. And he then says, "Oh, here, I'll give you this information." And he'll send a text message to his buddy. And the buddy says, "Thanks. Now I'm putting it in me." So getting back to your question, a lot of my patients who are very sensitive to mycotoxins, when we look at their gut microbiome, I mean, it's a desert wasteland in there. And I joke that if mycotoxins were as bad a problem as some people want to make it out, then everyone in New Orleans ought to be dead. Uh, because, it's swimming in black mold. And so why aren't they? Because a lot of people have the bacterial resources. And don't get me wrong, there's a microbiome that's just now being uncovered. And
Wow.
so you have this incredible ecological tropical rainforest. You should within your gut. And you got bad actors, you got good actors, and you have to have this balance. You have to have what Antoine Beauchamp called the terrain, the terroir. And I spend some time early in the book talking about the battle of giants between Pasteur and Beauchamp over germ theory. And unfortunately, the wrong guy won. But it's this balance that we've completely lost in our gut. And we can restore that balance. So yeah, there are other factors, but I think if you look at these super thriving really old individuals, they've got this amazing set of microbiome that have figured all this out. I mean, for instance, there are bacteria that can eat oil spills. There are actually fungi that can eat oil spills, and so it's like, come on, folks, this isn't rocket science. We're trying to make it, I think, more complex than it needs to be.
Yeah. Wow. In Plant Paradox, I remember you talking about these invaders in the body called LPS, which lipopolysaccharides, which you refer to eloquently as little pieces of shit.
Yep.
Um, but it seems like you changed your tune in the Gut Brain Paradox in this new book. You had a little rethinking about that, and I think it kind of ties into this whole terrain theory that we're talking about. It's the entire ecosystem, not just one thing. But yeah, was that one of the most surprising things that you walked away with this book, or maybe you want to talk about that and these LPSs?
And thank you for reading the book. I don't have a guest on my podcast without reading the book. And people are shocked. They go, "You've actually read the book? You're a busy guy." I said, I'm number one. Hopefully I'm going to learn something. Right. Dale Bredesen has a new book coming out. And I think, a week late in getting him a quote. And I said, "I really apologize." I said, "I've read your book." And he said, You read it? He said, "You didn't need to do that." I said, "Are you kidding? You just wrote a book. Of course I'd want to read your book." And
Yeah.
anyhow, so let's talk about LPSs, because this has actually come up a couple of interesting times. So we don't like bacteria to be in us, in our body, that we want them, fences make good neighbors. And we
I love
want
that. Yeah.
we want bacteria to be on their side of the fence for the most part. And what we now know is that bacteria, gram-negative bacteria primarily, but there are gram-positive LPSs. These, we can't tell the difference between a living bacteria and a dead bacteria. Our immune system basically reads the barcode on the bacterial cell wall, and it's literally like reading a barcode on groceries or reading your passport, and whether this is a good guy or a bad guy. And these LPSs, interestingly enough, can ride on fats through the wall of our gut, and they ride on fat carrying trucks called chylomicrons, and they hitch a ride. So there's a way across, and buried in the plant paradox, people don't notice that for the first 2 weeks of the plant paradox, I take away all of your fats except fish oil and perilla oil, and maybe we'll get to perilla oil in a minute. But even olive oil, and aren't I the guy who says the only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth? Yeah, that's true. But these LPSs can ride on olive oil. And we can actually measure these guys in antibodies to them in people's blood. So it's a pretty big deal. One of the arguments that can be made, and I pointed out in the plant paradox, of a no-fat diet, and I'm not a fan of a no-fat diet, but one of the arguments is, well, there's very little ways that LPSs could get into you on a no-fat diet. And maybe, just maybe, that's the mechanism on why that might work. There's always reasons that these things work. Not that fat is evil, but that maybe these LPSs don't have a way of getting into us. Okay. So when I was writing this book, we know that LPSs are not good. And yet, when you take like a germ-free mouse model and you put LPSs into their colon, their inflammation goes hog wild crazy. But if you put them into their small intestine, not only does nothing happen, but then they become tolerant if you then put LPSs into their colon. And you go, well, that's weird. How come that is? So I take people down this rabbit hole that When I was a teenager, I used to have horrible allergies, and they were so bad that I had to get allergy shots. Now, in allergy shots, you take a ragweed allergen, for instance, and you dilute it and you put it under somebody's skin, and you slowly but surely reintroduce more of this, and the immune system gets trained that, oh yeah, I know who that is. I'm used to this now. I'm tolerant of this, and I don't have to make a big deal of it. So you go, well, how are people? We know now that LPSs, if we swallow them, seem to have a beneficial effect. And you go, but LPSs are bad. So it turns out, which is really amazing to me, LPSs are on all spices. There are bacteria on all the leaves we eat. And there's a really healthy helping of LPSs in whole grains. And you start going, wait a minute, sure, there's tons of stuff that whole grains are really good for you. And unfortunately, whole grains happen to have lectins. And whole grains are not what whole grains used to be. They're loaded with glyphosate. But maybe the reason whole grains were good for you is because they had LPSs and they trained the immune system, because you swallowed them, that you don't have to get your panties in a wad when you see LPSs coming through the colon. And it's like, wow. And one of the things that just shocked me was the amount of LPSs on herbs and spices. And I mean, they're just coated with LPSs. And the cool thing is, even dried ones, the LPSs are right there.
Wow.
And isn't it odd that, well, maybe the reason herbs and spices are good for you is not because of polyphenols, which they have, but maybe because it's a way of introducing LPSs and calming down the immune system to be tolerant of these guys. And that was a really fun finding. Like I say, I like to figure out, okay, why are these things maybe potentially good for you? Now, having said that, almost all cultures in the good old days fermented their grains. All of our breads were fermented. Quinoa was fermented, and I can go on and on. But fermentation breaks down lectins, and I'm convinced that's one of the reasons everybody fermented things. Nowadays, that doesn't happen. But yeah, so introducing LPSs through a dietary source seems to be the magic, not magic, seems the way of training the immune system to not worry about these guys, which is exciting because these guys are always getting across the wall of our gut.
Yeah. Well, one of the things too, I think, if I remember reading correctly, is that you can get a lot of these LPSs through. I think you even recommend not cleaning the vegetables. Is that right? Like your first advice, right? Yeah, which I love, because I like a little bit of dirt. You said take it out of the garden, assuming that's glyphosate free and all that stuff. But but yeah, talk about that. I thought that was great.
Yeah, when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s after World War II, and people should know that actually during World War II, 42% of all of our food that we ate came out of victory gardens in people's homes and yards. And so we had a victory garden in the 50s and 60s. They were called victory gardens. And, we'd go out in the back and we'd pull out a carrot and we'd brush it off and we'd eat it. We'd take it inside. And one of the really interesting things is that root vegetables in particular, have a really impressive bacterial and fungal community about the roots. And we actually absorb nourishment and minerals via the fungi and bacteria in the root system. This is their soil. And so we should be actually acquiring these fungi and bacteria, particularly from root vegetables. And it may be that root vegetables, not only are they a marvelous source of resistant starches, but they're probably a marvelous source of these bacteria and even fungi that, lo and behold, we really need, and we need to get them a part of our ecosystem. Certainly, we've known for years that people who own dogs have a much better diverse microbiome than people who don't own dogs. Cats, unfortunately, not unless you have an outdoor cat, and then you get the benefit. Because those guys are always tracking in, dirt bacteria, soil bacteria, and licking our faces. And yes, let your dog lick your face, please. So.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, a lot of the book we're talking about this gut-brain paradox, this gut-brain connection, which a lot of people have heard about. And there's a lot of talk even many, many years ago about, it goes back even to Hippocrates, right?
Yeah, it was Hippocrates, yeah.
Yeah. So it goes back even farther, but I think there was that quote many years ago, 80% of your immunity is in the gut. But one of the things I found fascinating with what you were talking about was that the gut controls a lot of our brain decisions. Can you kind of explain how that gut bacteria might actually be thinking for us?
Yeah, I proposed a number of years ago that, number one, we don't have very many genes. You would think we're the most greatest creature of all time and we ought to have the most genes, but corn has more genes than us. A sand flea has more genes than we do. So what I propose is we have uploaded our computing power to our gut microbiome because there's 100 trillion just bacteria in our gut, and not to mention there are far more viruses, and there's a huge microbiome as well. And these guys are constantly dividing, and they're constantly exchanging information, like we talked about before. And they exchange information by what are called exosomes and extracellular vesicles. And I've just recently returned from a big meeting about these in Malta. There's actually the Society of Extracellular Vesicles. I kid you not.
You go into that in great detail in the book too, which is neat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we now know, so I'm convinced that this is our computing cloud. We know that most of the computing power is not on this phone, it's up there. And we accept that. And yet somehow we find it very hard to accept that maybe we sent the computing power down to our microbiome. And because they're actually exposed to all the information initially, and that the gut microbiome, since this is their home, might want to be in charge of the decision making that you make because it affects them. And the deeper into the weeds I go with this, the more impressed I am with the power of these sentient beings, and they are, over controlling, who's driving the bus. Well, in the book, I try to convince everyone that, guess what? They're driving the bus. Get over it. And not only get over it, but understand we now know we can affect how they drive the bus. And that's actually what's so empowering. Once you get over the fact that they're in charge, we know enough about them, what they want, what they do, how they control our mind, that we can take over and help steer them to steer us. So it's actually, exciting
Yeah,
to me.
it actually brings autonomy back into our lives, right? Because you now go, oh, I can actually control this based on what I'm feeding my body, based on maybe some supplements and maybe some of the
Yeah.
things we're putting in, right? Could you give an example on that though? Kind of what I'm thinking about is just because you talk also a lot of the book about leaky gut and how it actually leads to some of these diseases,
Yes.
Parkinson, bipolar disorder, depression. We gave an example about that. Um, how could people? What are some of the connections there, and maybe like what are some of the simple things? I mean, if everyone go out and read the book, but maybe there's some simple things you could start adding to change that trajectory. Or have you seen like a dramatic reverse in Parkinson's from some patients, or even anecdotally from people around the world, where it was just we simply changed that and boom, it went away.
Well, yeah, I actually start the book with a recent patient with Parkinson's, a lady in her 60s from um, Northern California who is a physician, and she developed and a marathon runner, and she developed Parkinson's. Had it for about 10 years when I met her, and her husband and she flew down to meet me, and she was to the point where she couldn't practice. She, had the typical mask of Parkinson's and tremor, and her husband did pretty much all the talking. And so we put her on my program, and she had really big time leaky gut and LPSs in her system, and so we put her on our program, and my PA and I trade off seeing people, and my PA had done a phone consult with them 6 months in, and things seemed to be getting better. So she came back a year later, and I walked into the exam room, and she's kind of standing there, and I actually didn't recognize her. And the first thing that happened is her husband jumps up from the chair and gives me a big hug and says, he looks me in the eye and goes, thank you for giving me my wife back. And I'm going, oh, well, yeah, okay, great. And then she doesn't have a tremor anymore. And so she says, oh, yeah, I'm back running now. And as their husband says, oh, yeah, she can beat me in a run now. And she couldn't even, walk a year ago. And so, eventually we're all kind of hugging and crying. And so, and this is in a year.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example from just actually last weekend. We have two patients who brought one of them has a sister who developed dementia and is in assisted living, and they wanted me to intervene. And quite frankly, we weren't making much progress because we can't control the food in assisted living, and all they get is basic, simple carbohydrates. She fell and broke her hip
Mm.
a few months ago, and she went to a rehab. And so this couple decided they were going to bring all the food while she was in rehab, and they were actually going to sit there and watch her eat the food. And the two of them took turns. And so they did this for 3 months. And then she's now back in assisted living, but they now are also bringing the food there. So 6 months have passed, and we've got her trajectory on her labs, and we've got her trajectory on her leaky gut. Long story short, her inflammation numbers are way down. Her leaky gut is much, much better. Not perfect, but much, much better. And so we're sitting right across where we are right now. And I'm saying, this is great. That fall was the best thing that ever happened to you, at least, from your lab standpoint. And so the husband and wife are going, well, the amazing thing is her memory is coming back. Her thought processes are coming back. And she says, yeah, it's really interesting. I'm remembering things that I didn't remember before, particularly short-term memory is what
Mhm.
really goes. And and I said, well, here, look, you're not making this up, because we can see the changes in your brain. We can see the changes in your leaky gut. We can see the changes in your microbiome. And now in just 6 months, you're a different person than you were. And, God bless your brother and sister-in-law, because they did the experiment, and it was a really good controlled experiment.
Yeah, that's amazing because you know this too. People that fall, they say like one of the biggest issue for people as they're aging is a hip fracture like that. They pretty much die because they
Yeah,
atrophy, they can't get up. I mean, it's a big indicator of death. So this woman
it
is
is.
like,
It's usually a death spiral. Yeah.
yeah. So that's so what a great inspiring story to hear, and that there is hope. So and just by changing that thing, also it just reminds me of just having advocates and people in your corner. It's so important because a lot of people that I've seen and I'm experiencing personally in my own families, when people are sick, it's very difficult for them to stay in that winner's mindset, and they actually really can't think for themselves. And it's really important to have those advocates to bring them the food. It's a lot of work, but it's important to have that. Huge.
Oh yeah. The husband was saying, he literally sat there. He brought her salad at lunch every day, and he would not leave until she finished the salad. And we were joking. She said, "You can go now. I'll eat it." He said, "No, I'm not leaving until this is gone." And he said, "I really became, the food Nazi." And maybe I shouldn't use that word, but yeah, he said, "I'm not leaving until it's gone."
Yeah.
So
Amazing. I wanted to ask you also, you talk a lot about, some of these bad gut bugs and how they can manipulate our cravings. And this kind of ties into even what probably what that woman was dealing with. Right now, we're at an obesity crisis, but also there's this tie in not only cravings, but even addictions. And it makes me think about just, the drug crisis too. But could you talk a little bit about what you learned with cravings and maybe even addictions and these compulsive behaviors and how it all ties in to the gut?
yeah, we've known, and I've written about this before. We've known that there are obesogenic bacteria and there are lean bacteria. And obesogenic bacteria, because they literally send text messages to the brain, and we've with each passing year we discover the language of how bacteria talk to the brain, control the brain. And a lot of it I go into are these packets of information in exosomes and extracellular vesicles that literally can latch on to any cell and disgorge their instructions into the cell to make things. We now know that they can carry mitochondria from one cell to another, and they can contain mRNA with instructions. So anyhow, we're beginning to realize that this communication system is really complex and very impressive. So there's a beautiful example in the British Medical Journal a few years ago that I've cited. There was a marathon runner, a woman in England, who was thin, and she developed a horrible bacterial colon infection called C. difficile, C. diff. And sometimes it's so bad that you have to have a fecal transplant to correct it. In which case, we try to get a donor who's a relative. Believe it or not, relatives share much of their microbiome. And interestingly enough, obese friends share obesity microbiome with each other, blah, blah, blah. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean you can't have obese friends, but stay a couple feet away from.
Well, there's a lot of science though, to your point, right? Like quorum sensing and some of this that shows
Oh
like,
yeah,
yeah, like, and we see it with women in their periods, right? If all the same women in the same house are like Wi-Fi, it's like a Wi-Fi, they're all linked up. It's the same thing. So it's like,
that's exactly right.
yeah,
So this woman got a fecal transplant from a niece who happened to be about 30 pounds overweight, and The fecal transplant went great. She recovered and she went back to jogging, etc. But over the ensuing year, she gained 30 pounds. Hadn't changed her diet, hadn't changed her exercise program, but now she had a different set of bacteria that were actually, these guys were actually, uh, they can extract more calories out of food and then pass them on to us. On the other hand, what you want is bacteria that will take most of the calories for themselves to make other little baby bacteria. And so people, I got some haters a couple of weeks ago. The second law of thermodynamics, calories in, calories out, does not apply to a living system. I'm sorry, because it doesn't take into account the microbiome that might be extracting more calories and giving it to it, or extracting more calories and keeping it for them. Anyhow, so here was a perfect example of same person, totally different microbiome. So then you go, well, if they can do that in terms of food seeking, we know, for instance, that certain bacteria love simple sugars. Really good bacteria, the guys we want in it, don't like simple sugars. They like complex sugars that they can ferment. And our diet has completely deprived them of what they need to eat, and they kind of die out. So I said, well, I wonder, are there other substances, are there other addictions that are driven perhaps by a microbiome that's seeking this out? And lo and behold, cigarette smokers have a completely different microbiome that seeks out nicotine. What was really amazing to me is the opioids. There is a microbiome that just loves opioids. Now, how do they get it? Well, they use pain as the driving force, and they cause leaky gut. They cause inflammation, which gives you pain. You then seek out what they're looking for. And the more of this that you take in, they actually make you more resistant to that effect by giving you more pain. And you have to get more to have the same effect. And this has been done in animal studies where you can show a tolerance in animals to these opioids. But if you then kill off the microbiome with antibiotics, all of a sudden, even a little bit of the opioid, has the effect. Then you repopulate these animals with the previous bacteria, and their tolerance comes right back, and they have to have more and more and more.
Wow.
That to me is really exciting news because the recidivism rate, the failure rate of rehab is 70 to 90% fail, whether it's alcohol, whether it's cigarettes, whether it's opioids, drugs. And it's because we are working on, this mental processing. And I think in the future, and I just gave a paper in Malta about this, what we should be doing in rehab is rechanging the gut bacteria through food and probiotics and prebiotics and postbiotics to shift this ecosystem. And because the really fun thing, the exciting thing is you can change this ecosystem. The nice thing is we can measure now who's in there. We're beginning to understand, like I've written about before, it's not as simple as just swallowing some prebiotics and probiotics. There's an assembly line that has to be built, and What we didn't know was, let's suppose we have to have 4 different bacteria to get the end product that we want. Each of those bacteria make a product that the next bacteria needs to make the next product. And if you're missing one of that, you could swallow all the prebiotic fiber in the world. You could take all the probiotic. But the good news is we're beginning to understand how complex this process is. And soon, we're not quite there yet, but this personalized medicine of who's in there, how do we get the right guys in there, how do we give them what they want to eat, it's really exciting because, like Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago, all disease begins in the gut. And I'll paraphrase him to say all disease can end in the gut.
That'll be the new quote. That'll be Dr. Gundry's quote. All disease can end in the gut. I love that. I also love what you just said because I think it's really important as a practitioner myself. And I always learn from people like yourself is that there is and I've learned that over and over again, there is a sequence and order. I think you just kind of alluded to that. And we're so, as biohackers and health advocates, we're so easy to go buy this probiotic. And, oh, I heard so-and-so on a podcast say this is a prebiotic. All these things are great. And I always tell people, well, thank God you did that because that led you maybe to Dr. Gundry. And now you're here in my office. And so thank God you tried all these things and it didn't work. But going to someone like a professional like you who understands that order, so valuable because it just cuts down on your time. And when you understand there is a roadmap, but it has to go in this order. And if you go out of order, you miss a lot of things. And I think it's really important that people understand that. I know we're getting close to the end here. I was going to ask you just to what you just mentioned, though, a little bit was, and you were alluding to, is just, are there any, if someone's listening, are there any just practical steps that you could recommend for them if they just wanted to start a little bit and take some baby steps in kind of, repopulating their microbiome or just, getting into this?
Well, one of the things that is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer, and you just have to follow the news that, for instance, we now know that young people, and let's define young people as in their 30s or 40s, there's this kind of epidemic of cancer, colon cancer and uterine cancer and ovarian cancer in young people. And everybody's going, oh, well, now we have to have colonoscopy when we're 40 and, instead of 50. Well, no, that's not the answer. It's like, why is this happening? Well, we now are pretty convinced, and there's some pretty cool articles coming out. Oh, guess what? It's because of the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome isn't making all these really cool compounds called short chain fatty acids like butyrate. And I talk a lot about butyrate in the brain and the gut. And we now know through stool testing that, in fact, most of the people with these issues do not make these short chain fatty acids. It's virtually 100%.
Wow.
And most people don't have the right bacteria to make these short chain fatty acids. So let me kind of finish with, there's a beautiful study that I actually talked about in Gut Check, but it's worth mentioning again. So there's a husband and wife microbiology team at Stanford who are named the Sonnenbergs. And they think we have a desert wasteland for our gut microbiome and we'll never get it back. And I respectfully disagree, but they're right. We do have a desert wasteland, but I think we can get it back. They took a bunch of volunteers and they gave them a really good prebiotic fiber called inulin. And I'm a big fan of inulin. And they looked at their gut microbiome diversity. And quite frankly, the more diverse your microbiome, the more tropical rainforest it is, the better. And then they looked at markers of inflammation. And despite all these prebiotic fibers, their gut microbiome diversity didn't change. Their inflammation markers didn't change. And they go, see, I told you. So they said, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a missing piece in here. So they took another group, gave them the same prebiotic fiber, but gave them fermented foods, primarily kefirs and yogurts, which had postbiotics, and did the same experiment. Lo and behold, with the addition of these fermented foods, their gut microbiome diversity got better and their inflammatory markers got better. So I think it's really helpful to realize that we're one of the first generations that really have not been eating fermented foods as a part of our diet. For instance, getting back to LPS, bread up until modern times was always fermented. Always. That was the only way you could do it. Yeah. Wine is a fermented food. Beer is a fermented food. Yogurts are fermented foods. Believe it or not, traditional sausages are fermented foods. So one of the easiest ways with my patients is get vinegars into them. And if they want to have a shot of apple cider vinegar or make a fake Coke, believe it or not, I was the first person to describe a fake Coke, which was balsamic vinegar and sparkling water. And when the TikTok craze came out, people said, wait a minute, you invented that. They pulled up my old YouTubes from 10 years ago. I said, see? Yeah. And so there's some easy steps that people can do.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I know we're running up on the hour. I did want to say one last thing too. And I saw you mention it numerous times and I underlined it because you kept mentioning it. And there's some of this magical bacteria, Akkermansia and butyrate, that combination. First time I heard of that was from Colleen Cutcliffe, who I'm sure you guys are very well connected. Do you see yourself coming out with any Akkermansia a product for yourself? It seemed like that was a big one that you had noticed as far as helping the gut. I was just curious, that could be something else people might look at in the future as well.
Yes. In fact, there's, believe it or not, so we've known about Akkermansia muciniphila for a number of years, and it really was the holy grail. And she spent 10 years of her life getting this bug to grow, the human Akkermansia muciniphila. And kudos to her. I'm a big fan of Pendulum Life. But what's really interesting is new research is suggesting that particular strain of the bug isn't the best. And we happen to know who's the best, and I'm not going to say anything, but you might be seeing that bug soon in a Gundry MD product.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You had to do that to me. Okay. But that's great. That's good to know. And I mean, if people read the book, you will see how many times it was brought up and how healing it is for the gut lining and just what it can do to help kind of really, it sounds like, to create those tight junctions and prevent gut long term. So very, very powerful and exciting stuff, man. Wow. Well, last but not least, where, Dr. Gundry, if people want to connect with you and learn more, where's the best place to connect with you and do all that fun stuff?
Well, so they can go to GundryMD.com. They can go to drgundry.com. GundryHealth.com is my telemedicine clinic. And we do leaky gut tests in telemedicine and food sensitivity tests. The Dr. Gundry podcast. I've got Instagram, 2 YouTube channels. Hopefully I pop up when you're scrolling through things and I'm waving at you. So hopefully you find me or I find you somehow.
Yeah, you're a pretty easy guy to find. So, all right, guys, we'll go out and get the book, type in Dr. Gundry. If you type that in Google, he will come up pretty much anywhere and everywhere. And if you want to find out that fake Coke video, you can find that too. Dr. Gundry, you're amazing, man. I appreciate all your work. It is so fun to read your books. They are so engaging. And every time I would come away with something new, and I just appreciate all the good that you're putting out there. It's making a difference. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Joel. I appreciate being on, and keep spreading the word.
Absolutely.